Each year, more than 46 million Americans will seek emergency room treatment for an accidental injury, most of which are preventable. So, what are your risks, and who can you trust to protect you? This is Safety Matters with Russ Kenzior.
This is Russ Kenzior, and you're listening to Safety Matters. I'm joined by my producer, Tony.
Good morning, Russ. How you doing?
I'm doing great. And as usual, we start the show with
Safety Matters in the news.
In the news. What's in the news?
What do you think's in the news?
Let me guess. Hang on. The first three don't count. Coronavirus.
Yeah, it's always in the news, isn't it? When is it going to be out of the news?
It won't be.
I mean, it's continues to spike, peak. I mean, whatever you want to call it, across the world. It seems like we're never going to get rid of this.
It's like an influenza. It's always going to be around.
Yeah.
It's just what kind of political agendas out there that's going to be controlled by it.
Right. And I was hoping now that we've had our elections that this thing would kind of fade away. We now have a vaccine, apparently, discovered by Pfizer. Yeah, out of Germany. It shows a lot of promise. And
90%.
90% efficiency.
And the CDC said they were happy with 50.
Dr. Fauci's must be a happy camper.
Yeah, he didn't seem to be.
There's a lot of people that don't seem to be. You'd think we'd be rejoicing about this.
He was pretty quiet when all the Biden people were out there dancing in the street in a festival of love.
No super spreader there, huh?
No super spreader.
We laugh, but there's such a political twist to this. You don't really know what the truth is. You really don't. I mean, it's a bad virus. Obviously, it's taken the lives of far too many people, not only in the United States but everywhere else. But the political side of this has just been, you just don't know what's going on. You don't really know the truth. You're getting conflicting information, conflicting statements. I'll tell you one thing, Tony, there's been a lot of winners in this. There's some companies that have cashed in.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of money being made by the hand sanitizer folks and PPE people and Amazon. I mean, I think Jeff Bezos made another couple of $1 billion just in the past 6 months.
Yeah, and certain retailers too as well.
Yeah, a lot of people have been big winners, but the American public as a whole has been kind of a big loser. We've been locked down. Feels like I've been in house arrest. How about you?
Yeah. I mean, it's the small businesses of the world of the United States that really are hurting. Yeah. Bars, restaurants.
Yeah, don't even go there. I mean, it's the lockdowns in certain parts of the country have never really lifted. We've been pretty good here in Texas. I mean, we've got a pretty good opportunity to kind of get back to a normal life. But boy, there are people across the country that they just can't even go out. I mean, it's been just really bad. And I feel bad for the kids, the children can't go back to school.
And the elderly, because they don't have the visitors that they had in the past.
It's kind of cruel, isn't it?
It is.
Really. Imagine these old folks that have just been separated by their loved ones. There's no real human contact.
Yes.
And the same is true for kids. They need social human contact.
Absolutely.
As well. So the coronavirus continues to rear its ugly head. I don't know when it's going to come to an end. I don't know. I mean, we're coming into flu season, right?
Yeah.
So we're going to expect a lot of people to mix up coronavirus with whatever the flu is. Did you get your flu shot?
No.
Well, you better.
Nah.
Otherwise, we're going to be finding ourselves with a kind of a crossfire of viruses. What's going to happen? Not certain what's going to happen now that we presumably have a new president. Not certain if that's going to be the case, but if it is, that's going to change the direction of this whole storyline.
Well, hopefully, like our dear friend, Mr. Como in New York, who just doesn't want to release it. Yeah. Oh, because it's a Trump.
Right. Let's not cure people because it's a political. What's more important?
I thought the whole thing was to try to find a cure or to have a vaccine for it.
Right. I mean, let's go back in time. I mean, when we started the show 4 months ago, that was right smack in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. And again, to refresh everybody's mind, because it's been 9 months since we've been dealing with this, or 10 months. But it was, we're going to shut down the country. so we don't flood the hospitals.
Right.
Okay, let's go back in time. That's what the whole shutdown was about.
Only for what, 2 weeks?
2 weeks, no longer than a month. It's just allow the hospitals to catch their breath. So when all these people are going into the hospitals for treatment, that we don't overwhelm them. That was the story that we were sold up front, right?
Right.
And it's on to make sense.
And America went with it. They were like, you know what? If it's for the good, we understand it.
Yeah, the president put together his task force, brought in the best minds in the country, Dr. Fauci, Dr. Birx, the whole team, headed by Vice President Pence, and they worked very hard on building respirators, creating, bringing the comfort, the ship to New York City, converting convention centers across the country into hospitals. We mobilized the country.
Right. He did a good job.
Well, depending who you talk to.
Yeah, I know.
We never really got the American people really united like we did around 9/11.
Right.
There was always half the country that said they resisted. They didn't like it. And I guess you're right. It is because Trump was president. They didn't want to, go along with anything he did. Now, that's pretty sad because what it did is it further divided our country along the lines of this pandemic. And so a month or so went by. The lockdown not only didn't get lifted, it got locked down even more.
Yeah.
More restrictions. And this was, of course, done by governors across the United States. Then came the big face mask dilemma.
Right.
Face masks don't work.
With or without.
They don't work. Face coverings. Where's the science? We've been hearing a lot about science.
We did our show, and we talked about the validity of science and what is science and how do they come up with theories and recommendations.
Right. We explained that, and so here we are. Plenty of people still contracting the virus. Oh, the third part of that was testing. We need testing.
Oh, yeah, and we've done a great job of testing.
Well, it depends again who you talk to. We have tested. There's all these quick test facilities now. I don't know how many millions of Texans have been tested, and
right.
for the most part, people that are testing positive are not contracting any serious side effects.
Right.
They're not dying. Most are not dying. In fact, I read the other day, as of November, the survival rate in the United States of coronavirus is 99.9%. 99.9% of people that are testing positive
right.
and getting sick, actually having conditions, respiratory conditions, et cetera, have a high rate of recovery. But you would never know that if you talk to the media.
No.
The media portrays it as the
gloom and doom,
the plague,
the dark winter.
That's right. We're going to have a dark winter. Well, I doubt it's going to be a dark winter. I think we're very well prepared, unlike in February where we had people getting sick. No way to treat it. No facilities. No shortage of respirators
right.
worldwide.
And most young people that get it do it's like a
right.
flu. They do feel, they lose the taste.
Right.
I know that for a fact because my daughter just had it.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, she had it, and her 10 days is already come and gone.
But there is an upside of children getting it because in school, the last thing they want to do is eat the cafeteria food. So
it doesn't matter. It doesn't taste good
right.
anyways.
Losing your taste makes the cafeteria food that much better. But, again, there's young children are suffering. Suicides are through the roof, sadly. Horrible side effects. By locking down the country, presumably to save lives, has possibly caused more lives. Certainly has destroyed more families. The divorce rate, we covered that, is skyrocketed in the country. Drug abuse, alcohol abuse, and, of course, suicides.
These are all sad side effects that are sometimes greater than the virus itself.
The unintended consequences, right?
And I think that's what, the United States as a whole has to recognize. And they have to come to terms with it, Russ.
We do. We have to come to terms with a bigger subject, and that's safety in general. I think a lot of people have woken up to the fact that safety plays a much bigger part of their life, affects their life, more so than they ever realized in the past. So
safety.
Safety. It's all about safety.
And that's why we've created the show. And
right.
And Russ, you have some new news.
Yeah, we're going to cover that in the next segment. We're going to spend some time talking about the podcast, the Safety Matters Show podcast, which is going to take up after this episode. This is the last show for Safety
Our
Matters.
last show.
Yeah, so we're going to make it a good one.
But you could still join us on
Safety
on the
Matters
podcast.
That's right, and on the website, the Safety Matters Show website, which you can download all future episodes, plus the Slip and Fall Guy podcast, which has been out for about a year.
Maybe in the next segment, let's talk about
Yeah.
Let's talk about the stories.
We'll talk about the stories of slips and falls. After all, that's what my background's all about. So we'll cover that in the next episode.
Sounds good.
Safety Matters with Russ Kenzier will be right back.
This is Russ Kenzier. Welcome back to Safety Matters.
Welcome back, everyone.
Tony, you and I have known each other forever. And I have spent the last 30 years of my life involved and invested in slip and fall prevention. And a lot of people that have reached out to me said, tell us more about your cases, slip and fall, trip and fall lawsuits.
Yes.
And so I'm going to cover a couple, one of which involved you.
Yes.
Okay. The first one dates back to, actually it's my first slip and fall litigation matter that I was retained in as an expert witness. This goes back to the mid-1990s, 1997.
You were 6 years old.
I was very young, very young, but smart as a Dickens. and it was a lawyer that called me. And at this time, I was running my first company called Traction Plus. We were a manufacturer of slip and fall prevention products. We had chemicals and floor matting and floor signs, the pop-open floor sign that everybody knows today.
Yeah, you were doing everything to prevent.
Correct. And that's where I built my career. My credibility came from being able to design, develop slip and fall prevention products.
As it is today.
Right. We put out the first line, one of the first lines of slip-resistant footwear, partnered with Walmart stores on the what was then called Traction Plus Tread Safe shoes. Tread Safe shoes are still available from Walmart.
Yes.
I'm no longer connected to the brand. So I built the industry around slip and fall prevention. And so one day I get a call from a lawyer who needed an expert witness on a case that he was working on. And I didn't know anything about the law. I'm not an expert witness. He said, no, you actually know a lot more about slip and fall prevention than really most quote-unquote experts.
Because you were doing all the research.
Right. So I was in the middle of it and didn't know it.
Right.
And so I said, well, look, I don't want to hurt your case. I don't hold myself out that way as an expert witness. And anyhow, I got retained. And this was a very troubling case. It carries with me actually to this day. The young girl out of East Texas, a little 16-year-old, 17-year-old cheerleader from here, East Texas, and she was working at a chicken restaurant, a fried chicken restaurant. And you know the story, don't you?
Yes, I do.
Our audience would find this to be a bit close to home.
Yeah.
We all have children that have, many of us that have children that worked in the fast food industry or had, the first job, the 16-year-old working at their first job. And so this young girl was working at a chicken restaurant, and she and her coworkers one night were closing the restaurant, and the store manager, the restaurant manager said, hey, we're going to have some fun. We're going to see who can slide the furthest on this floor, because they had a really slippery kitchen floor.
From all the grease.
All the chicken fat, the frying of chicken grease and fat. So it was, and again, this is a store manager saying, hey, let's have some fun on sliding on the floor, and we're going to have a contest who can slide the furthest on the floor. So it was kind of like a slip and slide. And so the first person runs and they slide, and next one, winds up the 16-year-old girl's turn. And so she's sliding, and she hits the dry spot on the floor. And it caused her to fall forwards. And so as she was falling forward, she reached out, and her arm went into a deep fryer.
Oh, my goodness.
Up to her elbow. This sweet little girl's arm went, and her hand went all the way to the bottom of the fryer. And this is 400-degree fat that they used to fry the chicken. And as they described the story to me, as she pulled her arm out of the fryer, her palm of her hand seared to the bottom of the heating element. And so when she pulled her entire arm out, it was third-degree burns, a lot of just horrendous injury. And this was all induced by let's have fun by slipping on the floor. Falls are funny. That's what people thought. Hey, it's funny, isn't it? Horrible injury, 16-year-old girl. Never get over that. I mean, I don't care how many levels of surgery, but that for anybody, especially a young girl, this is just a debilitating, devastating injury that she'll psychologically have to carry the rest of her life. And what was the second most compelling thing about this story, when I got retained, and I was being retained by the plaintiff, her attorney, this young girl's family's attorney. And I said, well, I couldn't understand why they didn't want to just make it right, why the restaurant, the insurance company, everybody would just want to make it right. I mean, there's no question what happened was clearly their fault. I mean, they knew their floors were slippery. They made fun of it. And he said, no, that's why I'm hiring you, is because they don't want to pay. And in the 30 years, Tony, I've been doing this, that still remains the most troubling part of my job, is how many companies understand and know how slippery their floors are. Big retailers, restaurant chains, hotels, go on down the list. They all know. Municipalities, schools, they all know.
Absolutely.
They do nothing about it. And when people get hurt, when children get hurt, older people get hurt, many people die. I thought, naively, back in the early 90s, that, well, they would just do the right thing. And that's why you have insurance, right, to pay those types of damages when something goes wrong. And then and now, nothing's changed. The insurance industry and many employers and many retailers, they fight. They'll spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal expenses, lawyers, to not have to pay a 16-year-old girl who has third-degree burns on her arm. And that just shocked me. And to this day, Tony, it stays with me. It's very personal. When I get retained in a lawsuit, it's very, very personal, because this could have been my daughter. In fact, it's in my book. I wrote a book, and the chapter in my book is called Chicken Run, because she was in a chicken restaurant and they were running. And I thought, my God, this could be my daughter. This could be your daughter. It could be anybody's daughter. This is somebody's daughter. And, you send them off to work thinking they're going to learn a lot about responsibility and all the things that come from, being a productive employee. And you never would imagine that you send your child off to a workplace and they come back so severely injured. And then on top of that, the employer doesn't want to make it right. And it's the thing that makes me so angry. I'm not a plaintiff advocate. I'm not a defense advocate. I'm a safety advocate. I'm all about safety. I'm all about doing the right thing for people.
From flooring to the products to the footwear, everything.
Yeah, and so that was one of the first cases, the actual very first case I worked on. And it ended, I guess you can say, favorably, but never make it right. She'll never be the same. Very, very traumatic for her and her family. You and I, as a matter of fact, a number of years ago, worked on a second case, if you remember. It was a woman here in Dallas.
Lyra.
Lyra. And she had slipped and fallen at a local grocery store chain and hit her head on the ground. And when she went into the grocery store chain, if I'm not mistaken, she was going into to purchase a prescription for her child. And at the time, I think Lyra was 45-ish, ran into the store, and when she was coming out, it started to rain, so the doors were blowing open in the grocery store chain, and they didn't have floor mats at the door. And so as she was walking out of the store, the floor was wet. She didn't know it. There were no mats and no wet floor signs, so she slipped and fell, hit her head on the ground. A number of witnesses witnessed her fall. She went home, and later that night she had to go to the emergency room because she was vomiting, and she broke a blood vessel in her brain. In fact, you and I
That's right.
did a movie about this.
Yes, we did a pilot that we were putting together, and the show was called
Safety Matters.
No. Falls aren't funny.
I know. And falls aren't funny. The little trailer, and I'm going to put that up on the website if anybody wants to watch it.
It does, because it brings it home.
Right.
I mean, everybody has a mother, a sister, a brother, an uncle,
right,
a friend.
This woman, Lyra, was forever changed. She was a dependent on her children. She could not function. She had a massive head injury. And again, it was a case that could have easily been prevented. The retailer didn't do the right thing, didn't have mats out, didn't have warning signs.
Right.
And it's not hard to do.
Yeah.
But it cost this woman, she didn't die, but my God, she was so severely injured. And you remember going to her home, and we had to videotape my interview of her, and just sad. Just a horrible injury. Her first lawyer, when she hired a lawyer, screwed up and dropped the ball, wound up dropping the case. And it was only after that a second attorney picked it up out of Dallas, a law firm out of Dallas, and he hired me, and I'll never forget going the whole gambit here, going to trial, and just a horrible example of a retailer who was just negligent. Just horrible experience.
Now, you wrote a book, and you have tons of stories on this. And then you also wrote a second book, correct?
Third book. I have 3 books. The book you're referencing is called Floored, Real Life Stories of a Slip and Fall Expert Witness, and I think there's 50 or so chapters. And these are some of the chapters. These are some of the experiences I have in the field of safety, specifically slip and fall prevention. And the reason I tell the stories is because they matter. These are real people, real injuries, real families, many of which died. And as an expert witness, when I get involved, I'm involved. It's personal to me. And by the way, I work on both sides. I represent plaintiffs and defendants. Most people, when they hear slip and fall litigation, tend to think they're frivolous. They're not. In fact, less than 3%, according to the insurance industry, that is, 3% or less of slip and fall claims are considered fraudulent. Most are legit.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't know that if you listen to the mainstream media. You never hear stories about slip and fall victims. You only hear about fraud. That's it. You never hear the real life stories of people like Lyria or the girl out of East Texas who was forever changed. And what happens is it jades people.
And it's such a small percentage of the that people think that that was just done. It's set up. As I say,
you tend to think this is fraudulent. You tend to think these are frivolous, and that's fine. Until it happens to you.
That's right.
Until it happens to you.
Well, Russ, one thing that I could always, from all these years knowing you, you're a straight shooter. You tell it like it is.
Yeah, that's good and bad, though, isn't it? Some people don't want to hear the way it is.
Yeah.
But I don't know, between my company, Traction Plus, and the work I do now, and my work for the National Floor Safety Institute, how many lives, I presume, I've saved or helped prevent people from injury. In fact, on the next segment, I'm going to be interviewing Brent Johnson with Traction Auditing. He's one of the leading companies, technicians, what's called a walkway auditor, that goes out and actually tests floors. Now, you would think, Tony, that retailers, property owners who are plagued with slip and falls, just plagued. It's the leading cause of workplace injury. It's the leading cause of guest injury for pretty much every industry, slips and falls. You would think that property owners, retailers, hospitals, just every industry would be advocates for wanting to know if their floors are slippery, wouldn't you?
Yes.
The reality is it's quite the opposite.
And that's why we do this show, Russ. It's, we're advocates for the whole safety institution.
Right.
And everyone says, basically it's boring. Why do we really need safety? But
yeah.
Until it happens to you.
Hey, here we are in the world of coronavirus, right?
That's right.
Everybody's worried about safety.
So,
but yeah, when we come back, I'll be interviewing Brent Johnson with Traction Auditing, and he's going to just talk about his experience in the last 10 or 12 years of testing floors across the country.
You're listening to Safety Matters with Russ Kenzier.
Welcome back to the show. This is Russ Kenzier. In the world of safety, everything kind of boils down to testing. If you want to know if the water that you're drinking is safe, you test it, or somebody should be testing it. If you want to know that the food you eat is safe, well, that needs to be tested as well, holding temperatures, etc. A food play an important role in preventing people from getting sick. Well, in the world of slip, trip, and fall prevention, the same holds. Testing of floors is really the first line of defense in preventing accidental slips. And joining me this morning is Brent Johnson with Traction Auditing, which is based here in Southlake. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So tell our audience a little bit about Traction Auditing, who you are and what you do.
Well, we're a company that specializes in testing the coefficient of friction of walkway surfaces. That's where the rubber meets the road and slip, trip, and falls happen. We have people that are proactive, customers that are proactive. We're in there at least annually testing their floors to make sure their employees and customers are safe. And then the other half of our business is with attorneys after the fact.
Reactive. Do most companies test their floors, or business owners in your experience actually go out and have folks like you or themselves test their floors?
Unfortunately not. Most of the time we're in there after the fact.
And I forgot to ask, how long have you been doing this?
We've been doing this 13 years.
13 years. And in your experience, very few companies actually...
Very few. We encourage them, we talk to them, and many times it's they love the idea, but they're not going to spend the budget money. It depends on whose pockets it's coming out of.
Wow. When you say whose pocket, meaning the insurance companies?
Well, we get that response. That's why we carry insurance. And that's unfortunate for the people that do slip and fall. And as you know, there's many people a year that are killed just from slips and falls.
Yeah, about 35,000 on average people will die as a result of a slip and fall, and millions seek emergency room treatment. But that's a bit surprising, or would be a bit surprising to our listeners, is to know that property owners don't really test their floors, so they really don't know how slippery they are until somebody gets hurt.
That is correct. But if you ask them, they're going to tell you, "Oh, our floors are fine."
Why do you think that is? I mean, what's the hesitancy? Is it cost? Is it not wanting to know? They don't want to hurt people. They don't want people to get hurt. But why the hesitancy?
We have still never figured that out, because if you know, then you can fix it. And if you don't know, then you're just setting yourself up for failure.
So if you find a problem, then that would trigger some remedy. You'd have to fix it.
You would have to fix it, but then you don't have to worry about it anymore.
Right, but I'm just thinking, if maybe they don't want to fix it because it costs money to fix it, so we'd rather not know.
But most of the time, it's not that expensive to fix.
Wow, that's really quite a surprise to many people, not to me or you, because we work in this field. But have you found any success with insurance companies? Do they recommend or require their policyholders to do any testing of their floors, property owners?
No, they do not. We've been working with them and trying to get them to do that, just as if you were taking defensive driving, you get a discount. Why not do that with testing your floors?
Yeah.
That way you know, and they're not having to pay out of pocket.
And they don't do that, or they do that?
A few do it. Most do not.
Wow. Well, do the insurance companies provide testing? Do they go out and test?
Some do. I know that in teaching the National Floor Safety Institute class, walkway auditing certificate holder class, we usually have one or two insurance guys in every class. And they go out and they help their clientele.
You mentioned earlier coefficient of friction. Explain to our audience just basically what does that mean? Slip resistance? What are you testing? What does coefficient of friction mean?
Well, it is basically how slippery the floor is. The term we use is available traction. So how high traction or low traction the floor is. And there's a scale, there's a national standard that applies to that. Unfortunately, it is strictly voluntary, and they take advantage of that.
Meaning it's not a law. You don't have to test.
That is correct.
Is the testing done under wet or dry conditions?
We do the vast majority of our testing is under wet conditions, because the majority of slips and falls happen on a wet floor.
Which standards do you rely upon?
We use the NFSI B101.1 and B101.3 for the actual testing. Then we've got clients that when we're in there and set up safety protocols for them, we use the B101.0, which is a testing guideline for us to set up their safety protocols.
Are there any other standards that call for testing of floors? I mean,
yes, absolutely. The ANSI A1264 specifically says that walking surfaces shall be monitored for their slip resistance characteristics. And that's a shall. That means it's not optional.
it's a must.
It's a must.
So if I'm being devil's advocate here, most of your work is spent working for attorneys.
Unfortunately, yes.
Representing both plaintiffs and defendants?
Correct, about 50-50.
Okay, so you're on both sides, and it always comes down to how slippery is the floor.
Correct.
That their client deliberately didn't want to know prior to the injury and subsequent lawsuit.
Correct. Even when we work for the defense side, it's because they didn't do what they should have been doing.
Well, that raises the question. You just read a portion of a standard that requires testing, and so if you're representing a defendant or a plaintiff, it doesn't really matter. The standard of care, as it's known in the industry, requires testing. They didn't perform testing, meaning the defendant. Does that increase their liability, the fact that they weren't testing?
Absolutely. The plaintiff attorneys especially, they're always looking for that weak spot in a case, and if they're not doing it, and there it is in the national standard saying it, they shall do it, that's a must, and they're not doing it, then that just is a huge hole in their defense.
You know, we talk about standards a lot, and many industries have different types of standards. Do the flooring manufacturers have any floor safety standards? Companies who make floors?
They have the A108 standard, and it is not nearly as stringent as the standards that we use for testing.
Is that a safety standard?
No, that's a quality control standard.
Okay. So they test for quality control, but not for safety.
Correct.
So how does a consumer, how does a defendant know that the floor that they selected was in fact safe?
Well, unfortunately, there's been a lot of confusion caused by that. And so they get the cut sheet for the flooring, the architects do, and they depend on that. And then come to find out, it's like I say, a quality control standard and not a safety standard. And it states that in the standard itself. And they end up using the wrong testing methods.
Have you ever been, or have you done any work for the flooring industry? Do they hire guys like you? The floor covering manufacturers bring in walkway auditors?
No, they have their own labs that they test their products.
But I'm saying in the real world, not in a lab. If they want to know how their product is performing in a real world application, do they have?
I've been hired by one manufacturer. The rest have all been end users.
Okay. You mentioned architects. What role do they play in all this?
Well, they have to specify what is on the floor when it's designed, and if they are given bad information, then they can make bad choices, and inadvertently. And if they use the correct choices, we have interior designers that send us samples, and it's got to pass the NFSI standard, or they will not use it. And so a lot of times we'll get it from architects, we'll get it from interior designers, we'll test it in the office. They'll send us several random samples, and we can go back and tell them, does it comply with the standard?
Yeah. Do the architects understand that when they're specifying a product, a floor, that the standards for safety of that floor are governed by the National Floor Safety Institute, the NFSI standards, and that the quality control, meaning squareness, hardness, density, all the things that go with quality control for manufacturing of ceramic tiles, governed by that ANSI A108 committee, and so they're different. I mean, there's different reasons for testing. So if a product manufacturer, as you mentioned, is testing in their lab, well, they're not testing for safety, they're testing for quality control. But do the architects get that when they're specifying a floor, which standards they should be relying on? Do they rely on the NFSI standards? Which ones?
In my opinion, they unfortunately rely upon the manufacturer's standards. A few that have been educated that know and have educated themselves, they rely on the NFSI standards. But unfortunately, every tile that they look at has information sheet, and it's got the information from the manufacturer on there.
So how can people get a hold of you or learn more about you?
Well, we have a website that's www.tractionauditing.com. They can go to tractionplus.com, reach us that way, and just send us a message. We'll get right back to you.
And Traction Plus, what is that?
Traction Plus is a product that we have that enhances the coefficient of friction of different types of floors.
Gotcha. So it's a aftermarket treatment.
It's an aftermarket treatment. Actually, it's a daily cleaner so that you can maintain that.
Gotcha. I've been speaking with Brent Johnson from Traction Auditing and Traction Plus about measuring testing of floors for safety, and we appreciate you coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome back to Safety Matters. This is Russ Kenzior.
And this is Tony B. Welcome back.
You are Tony B.
Yes, I am.
I got a couple stories I want to share. A couple more stories. One is one that I worked on just within the last year or so, and it was actually a fascinating story because it kind of affects everybody's daily life. It was a lawsuit against a retail store, grocery store in South Texas, and a gentleman, I think it was like in the 70s, it was a Vietnam War vet, had gone into the grocery store, worked in the oil industry, the oil patch. He had a steel-toe boots on. He goes to buy a watermelon. Mm-hmm. And he walks up to the display of watermelons, and you've all seen a big box
Right.
on a pallet.
You reach over,
grab your watermelon, and away you go.
you thud it, tap
Right,
it.
if you know what you're doing. That's a trained watermelon.
Give it a slap.
Right, you got to know what you're buying.
Right.
Anyhow, he picked up watermelon out of the box. Unbeknownst to him, his shoe, his boot, steel-toe boot, got stuck in the opening of the pallet, the wooden pallet.
Gotcha.
So as he turned,
stayed.
His foot got stuck. And, of course, he couldn't feel it because he's got steel-toe boots. So he turns, he falls, and shatters his elbow. Terrible injury. So he's really in bad pain. He goes to the cashier, who is, by the way, seen on surveillance video, leaning up against the cash register texting. Okay? And you see him go up, and there's no audio, but you see him go up, and he's talking to her, and this came out in the deposition and the trial, and he's like, I really hurt my elbow. I need an ambulance. And she's like, well, you look fine to me.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, you're fine to me. What's the problem? So he had to drive himself to the hospital, which they did emergency surgery on his elbow. So he got really hurt. So I get hired in this case, and it comes down to a very, very simple matter, and that is, was the pallet, the way it was displayed, the box on the pallet, was that an appropriate display? Well, anybody that knows anything about pallets knows that pallets are not displays. They're used to transport materials, right? I mean, so
logistics.
That's right. So the pallet is a way to transport material. So if you're in the field and you're picking watermelons, they put them in a big box. They put them on pallets. They put the pallets on a truck.
And the forklifts take it up.
Right.
Put it up, wrap it.
Take them to a distribution center, and eventually they get unloaded at a retail store, grocery store.
Right.
So if you want to use pallets to display the watermelons, that's fine. You just have to use what's called a pallet skirt.
Sure.
That's a little plastic frame. Goes around the base of the pallet. You've seen
Gotcha.
them.
Yes.
Kind of dresses it up.
Cardboard, sometimes
Yeah.
plastic.
Right, and it protects the opening.
Right.
It also protects, any type of, nails that might be sticking out, or
Sure.
or, the wood might be sharp, and
Right, splinters.
Yeah, you don't want children, somebody walking by, maybe wearing sandals.
Get scratched by it.
Right, so it's a very, very simple process. You put a pallet skirt, okay, around the bottom. Well, they didn't do that. And so I'll never forget, this case went on, and they were fighting it, Tony. It was just keep going. And I remember going to trial. This is a small town in South Texas, outside of Corpus Christi. And I went to testify, and it was forever. I mean, I was on the stand for hours. And of course, I was representing the plaintiff. The defense attorney kept asking me, well, Mr. Kenzior, you're an expert witness, and you know a lot about this subject. Yeah. I stayed at a little town, by the way, a little motel or hotel in this town. Well, Mr. Kenzior, did you, since you stayed overnight, did you go across the street and see the HEB? Yes. Do they have pallet skirts around around their watermelons? No, they sold watermelons, but they didn't have pallet skirts. Oh, how about up the street there was a Walmart? Did you happen to go in there? Well, I have nothing else to do. I'm there the night before, not a lot in this town. And I said, yeah, as a matter of fact, I did. And they were selling watermelons, and they didn't have pallet skirts around their watermelons either. And so the lawyer goes to me on the stand. He says, so then you'd agree that the standard of care does not call for using these pallet skirts. I mean, nobody else does it, so why should my client? And I looked at the jury, and I looked at the judge, and I looked back at the lawyer, and I said, well, we have Walmarts where I live, here in North Texas, and we have other retail stores, and they use pallet skirts. They use pallet skirts around their watermelons and their displays. And I looked at the jury and I said, but maybe that's different. The folks that, live in my community are richer people. And maybe they deserve a higher level of safety than you people down here. And after all, you don't get the highest quality food. You don't get the highest quality service. You don't get the best meats. You don't get safety. Safety is just for rich people. $19 million jury verdict.
Good for you, Russ.
That's what they gave him. And my point was, just because other retailers don't do it right, because they don't want to invest in safety, because you know what? It's a small, poor community. You can get away with that. Up here in Dallas, come on, it's very competitive. The grocery stores are extremely competitive. I mean, they fall over each other to give you as much as they can. But it's different. And when you get out of your cocoon and you travel around the world, you travel around the country, you see how some people really don't get treated fairly. It isn't right. And sadly, it's all too common. I'll never forget the case, and this is my second story, where I got retained by a plaintiff. And actually, it was a plaintiff attorney that retained me, but he retained me just to cite statistics. And it was a case in Louisiana, outside of Monroe, Louisiana. And went to this courthouse in the middle of summer. Place was packed, little tiny town again. Yeah. Place is packed. And I'm like, well, okay. I was brought in to just talk about statistics. And the statistics they wanted to know about was, Mr. Kenzier, on behalf of the National Floor Safety Institute, you do a lot of research, and you published some research that pointed to the fact that household floor cleaners, the product used at home,
like Tide,
Mr. Clean, whatever you put on your floor, Spick and Span, Lysol, those kinds of products,
right?
That many of them, based on your research, will leave a slippery film on the floor.
And they do.
And so that was pretty much the brunt of my testimony. So I'm like, well, what's this lawsuit about? I mean, Tony, this little courthouse was packed. I'm like, what's going on? I mean, what's the suit about? Well, come to find out, it was a case where an elderly couple, very small town in Louisiana, were being sued by their housekeeper. And what had happened is their housekeeper, who worked for them for many, many years, had mopped their floor in their home with an over-the-counter floor cleaner. And as the housekeeper was putting her supplies away, picked up her check, and started to leave the house, she slipped on the floor. She mopped and hurt her knee very badly. In fact, needed surgery. So the homeowner said, don't worry about it. We have insurance, homeowner's insurance, and we'll make it right. Yeah. Well, the homeowner's insurance wouldn't cover it. Ooh. Because she was a contracted employee. And this is important for the audience to know. If you hire people to do work in your home and they get hurt, your homeowner's insurance policy may not cover those injuries because they're contracted. They were hired to be there. Okay, so it's a legal issue. So the insurance company wouldn't pay. This woman had a serious knee injury, and so she sued the homeowners. And I was there to testify that the product the homeowner gave her the cleaning product, that cleaning product was the source of her slip and fall. Not the fact the floor was just wet, but she used a product that made it slippery. And I thought, gosh, that's a long shot. I mean, really? Really? That's the suit? Well, come to find out, when it's all said and done, she won. The housekeeper won. And the homeowners, of course, were probably still tied up for years with the litigation. And they wound up, they couldn't pay her. They wound up giving her the house. The housekeeper now lives in the house that she used to clean. And the elderly couple, and by the way, the whole courthouse was filled with everybody in town who knew this couple. Their family, their friends, they had a business, very well-known people. So the person who cleaned their house now owns their house. And that's again, the world of safety. Yeah, that's it.
Nobody wants to talk about it and put it off to the side. It's boring, but I don't want to hear about it.
Until it happens to you. Then it's your crisis.
I know.
And everybody has their own stories. And but that's what the show's been about safety. The book that I'm referring to is probably one of the most popular, Floored, Real-Life Stories from a Slip and Fall Expert Witness. You can purchase it from my website. You can purchase it on Amazon. And it's just stories like that. Real-life stories of real people and real injuries.
Well, Russ, let's, since this is our last broadcast, we are moving into the next new realm. You have been doing it all along on this podcast, but we're going to be moving more into the podcast and possibly even streaming sometime soon.
Yeah, and that's a good segue. The Slip and Fall Guide podcast, which I've been doing for over a year, which is internationally very successful, is now called Safety Matters. And so the radio broadcast will now be exclusively available online on through the website and through the podcast under Apple or as an Apple or Google podcast. So it's going to take that new dimension, that new step. We will also be putting out in the months to come a YouTube channel where people will get to see me and you.
That's right. And call in, possibly.
That's right. Have some feedback. And so I cannot tell you how much I enjoyed doing the show with you.
Radio listeners, we thank you and come and visit us on our podcast.
Yeah, just go to thesafetymattersshow.com if you want to check it out online, or the Safety Matters Show on Apple and Google Podcasts. You will get all the episodes. We saved all the episodes on the podcast, including the Slip and Fall Guide.
And we'll be bringing up newer things as well and bringing up to the audience.
That's right. And that's the goal. Our goal is to make the world a little safer by educating people
awareness
to matters of safety.
Absolutely.
So with that, this has been America's Slip and Fall Guide, joined by my producer,
Tony B.
Thanking you for listening to the show.